There are moments in life when pain doesn't simply arrive, it is delivered. Not accidentally, not unknowingly, but with intention. Like a dagger slipped between your ribs by someone who knew exactly where to aim. What wounds deeper than betrayal is the callousness that follows it, the cold shrug, the smirk, the silence. You were left bleeding, but what stunned you more was that they didn't flinch. Not even a flicker of remorse danced in their eyes. They hurt you and felt no shame in doing it. You searched their face for softness, for regret, for even a whisper of guilt. But instead you found indifference, as if your pain was entertainment, as if your worth was disposable. You asked yourself, how could someone I loved, someone I trusted, look at my suffering and feel nothing? And in that moment, shame didn't just belong to them. It crept onto your shoulders too. You began to question your own value, your judgment, your kindness. You asked, did I deserve this? Did I misread everything? Am I the fool for caring too much? Their sin became your burden. Their coldness made you feel weak. That's what shame does. It doesn't always come from our failures, but from the weight of another's cruelty. But let me tell you something sacred and unshakable. God was watching. Every insult they thought you didn't hear, every betrayal they masked behind smiles, every moment you fell apart quietly while they went on laughing, he saw it all. And though he stayed silent then, not out of neglect, but of wisdom, his silence was never absence. It was patience, divine patience that always precedes justice. There is a truth older than the stars and more certain than the sunrise. What is done in cruelty will echo in justice. The shame they hurled at you without thought is on its way back, not because you wished it, but because life, when governed by a just God, returns every unpaid debt. They thought their actions would dissolve into the past, but the past is not dead. It is buried, and God knows where every grave lies. What they did is not forgotten in heaven's court. It is written. And when heaven writes, it does not use fading ink. You may not be in a courtroom, but your pain has presented a case, and God, the judge who sees motives, not just moments, is preparing his verdict. It may not come when you expect it. It may not even look how you imagine it, but it will come. Not because you demand revenge, but because God demands justice. And the most ironic justice of all, the shame they denied in the moment will become the shame they can't escape in the future. They hurt you without flinching. Now every echo of your pain will trail them like a shadow, growing heavier with time. They will feel it when they are alone, when silence surrounds them, when they try to outrun it by chasing noise or achievements. It will not leave, not because of your bitterness, but because of divine balance. What they dismissed will disturb them. What they mocked will haunt them. What they belittled in you, they will soon search for in themselves and find it gone. And in that unraveling, God will be whispering, this is not punishment. This is reflection. The very shame you dished out returns not as revenge, but as revelation. So breathe. You do not need to carry their shame anymore. It is not yours. God is already walking it back to its rightful owner, and he does not miss his mark. Shame without remorse is the beginning of spiritual blindness. What they couldn't feel then, they will be forced to face later. There is a kind of cruelty that doesn't yell, doesn't strike, doesn't scream, but instead wounds in silence and walks away without turning back. It doesn't ask, did I hurt you? Because it never intended to ask. The absence of remorse is not simply a lack of empathy. It's a symptom of something far deeper, spiritual blindness. It is when the soul no longer sees the image of God in others, when people are reduced to objects, tools, or obstacles, and those who hurt without shame have already begun to lose their sight, not in their eyes, but in their hearts. You see, shame is not just a feeling, it is a signal. It tells us when we've crossed a line, when we've gone too far, when we've touched something sacred and left a bruise. To hurt someone and feel shame is to still have a conscience, but to hurt someone and feel nothing, that is when something holy has gone missing. That's when the spiritual eyes begin to close and the soul walks further into darkness. They didn't just hurt you. They dismissed the very notion that it mattered. They treated your emotions like noise, your tears like inconvenience, your humanity like clutter. And in doing so, they lost more than your trust. They lost the ability to see themselves truthfully. That's what shame is supposed to do. It's supposed to hold up a mirror, but they smashed that mirror long ago. Yet God, in His mercy, does not let blindness go unchallenged. He will not let their numbness be the final chapter. There will come a time, a sacred, irreversible time, when they will be forced to see, not because you demanded it, but because truth, when ignored long enough, becomes a burden too heavy to avoid. What they couldn't feel when they hurt you, God will now place in their own heart, not as punishment, but as awakening. And it often arrives in strange ways, maybe through someone doing to them what they once did to you, maybe through the loss of something they thought they'd never lose, maybe in a quiet moment when they're alone with their thoughts and the past creeps in uninvited. Whatever the path, God ensures that those who hurt without shame are not allowed to escape the mirror forever. One day, they will stand face to face with the person they became, and for the first time they'll feel what you felt, not through your story, but through their own suffering. This is not cruelty from heaven, it is mercy wrapped in justice, because spiritual blindness must be healed with light, and light, to the one who has dwelt too long in the dark, feels like fire. But that fire will burn away the numbness, it will restore sight, and with that sight will come the shame they refused to feel when you were bleeding. What they ran from will now find them, not to destroy them, but to deliver the weight they once avoided. And in that moment, God will be as present with them as He was with you. God never forgets the pain that was ignored. He stores it as evidence in His time of justice. There is a peculiar kind of ache that lingers in the soul long after the bruises fade. It is not the pain of what was done, but of how quickly it was dismissed, how easily your cries were silenced, how swiftly they moved on, as if your suffering was just a phase they didn't care to witness. But though they forgot or pretended to, God never did. Heaven keeps receipts, not to shame you, but to vindicate you in the right time. When you were up late at night, replaying everything, trying to find the moment when things went wrong, wondering if you could have stopped the avalanche before it crushed your spirit, God was there. Not one tear dropped without being noticed. Not one prayer went unheard. Not one scream into the silence was lost. Where the world overlooked your pain, God archived it. He collected your sighs like sacred artifacts, and while the ones who hurt you erased their guilt and walked away, God etched the truth into eternity. What you endured in silence is not forgotten in heaven's courtroom. It is written, recorded, preserved, because divine justice does not operate on convenience, it operates on truth. The shame they never carried will now be carried back to them in the form of consequences, delays, loneliness, or internal unrest. Not because you wished them harm, but because justice is not about vengeance. When someone hands another pain without accountability, God collects the imbalance and stores it, like evidence, in a case that has not yet reached trial. And trials in heaven don't need human witnesses. God doesn't need anyone to defend you. He saw it all himself. He watched how you were treated, how they twisted facts, how they stood proudly over your crushed spirit, and he let it go on for a season. Not because he was absent, but because divine justice waits until the heart is soft enough to break. He waits until pride grows so large that when it falls, it echoes. The longer the delay, the louder the justice. So when you wonder why it seemed like they prospered while you suffered, remember this: God was building a verdict. He was giving them time to repent, to reflect, to repair. But if they continued without remorse, if they glorified themselves while standing on the ashes of your dignity, then God will answer. And that answer will come in ways no human can prevent. What was ignored will now speak. What was silenced will now roar, not from your mouth, but from God's. And when it does, you won't need to defend your past. You will be standing in peace while they stand in reckoning. You will not be vindicated through revenge, but through restoration, because the God who never forgot your pain has always been preparing a return that no one can deny. The shame they placed on you will return to them when their masks no longer hide what they've become. Shame is a strange thing. When you carry it, even though you did no wrong, it begins to distort the way you see yourself. You begin to question your worth, your intentions, your decisions, not because you failed, but because someone else treated you like you were disposable. And that treatment, when internalized, can cloak your soul in self-doubt. But what you didn't know then was that shame never belonged to you. It was borrowed pain, placed on your shoulders by someone who refused to face themselves. They hurt you and gave you their shame so they wouldn't have to carry it themselves. And for a while, you carried it so well they convinced themselves they were innocent. They wore masks. Masks of charm, decency, power, kindness. And behind those masks they concealed their guilt. They told others a version of the story where you were the problem, the weak one, the emotional one, the one who couldn't handle reality. Their masks allowed them to function without facing what they had truly done. But God does not deal with masks. He deals with hearts. And hearts don't lie to him. Eventually, the pressure of living a lie becomes unbearable. The mask begins to crack, not from outside judgment, but from internal decay. The false image they maintain starts slipping when life no longer bends to their ego. The people they deceived begin to notice the inconsistencies, the coldness, the patterns. The charm that once covered the cruelty begins to fade, and slowly, painfully, the truth starts leaking out, not because someone exposed them, but because God allows nothing hidden to stay hidden forever. This is the moment when shame circles back, not as a punishment from you, but as a mirror from heaven. They look at themselves, and what they see is not who they pretended to be. The image they crafted no longer aligns with the damage they caused. The gap between who they are and who they wanted to be seen as becomes too wide. And in that gap, shame returns, raw, inescapable, heavy. What they thought they had buried begins to resurrect in their relationships, in their dreams, in their solitude. They remember how you looked when they walked away. They recall your voice, your silence, your confusion. And suddenly, what they once justified begins to haunt them. That shame no longer disguises itself. It screams. And it does not come to ruin them. And the beauty in all of this? You don't have to say a word. You don't have to fight to prove who you were. You don't have to expose what they did. Life, under God's justice, has its own way of unmasking truth. The pain they gave you, the shame they made you carry, will now be sitting in their own chest, not as a lesson you forced, but as a reality they can no longer avoid, and the shame they thought they escaped becomes the very thing they can't hide from anymore. What they mocked in you will become what they lack in themselves, and that emptiness will shame them louder than your silence ever did. There is something deeply cruel about being mocked for the very traits that made your heart beautiful. They saw your patience and called it weakness. They saw your loyalty and treated it like desperation. Your empathy was seen as fragility, your honesty as foolishness. And instead of honoring what made you different, they laughed at it, they diminished it. They made you feel like your purity was your problem, but the very things they mocked were the things they secretly envied and feared, because those traits reminded them of what they had lost in themselves. You didn't pretend to be strong by stepping on others. You didn't fake confidence by belittling someone else's heart. You didn't compete, manipulate, or control. And in a world where darkness often dresses itself as power, your light unsettled them. So they tried to smother it. But what they didn't realize was that mocking your light didn't extinguish it. It only revealed how dim their own had become. The cruelty they used to humiliate you was a mask for their own insecurity, and in time that mask would slip. As life moves forward, the things they once laughed at become the very things they begin to crave. They search for people who are kind, stable, sincere, but everywhere they turn they are met with coldness, games, and emptiness. And suddenly your qualities, the ones they dismissed, begin to haunt them. Not because you're still around, but because the void you left behind cannot be filled with anything superficial. They try to build connection without trust. They try to receive loyalty without giving it. They look for peace in people who mirror their own brokenness, and all they find is chaos. And slowly, realization sets in. They don't just miss you, they miss what you carried. They begin to understand that what they ridiculed was a gift they mistook for a flaw. And now, in their own emptiness, they feel a shame so loud that your silence feels like thunder. It is not your voice they hear in their mind, it's the echo of everything they overlooked. The warmth in your words, the patience in your actions, the sincerity in your presence. And what once annoyed them becomes what they now yearn for. But it is no longer within reach, because what they lacked before has only grown deeper, and what they once mocked is now the very thing that shames them. God's justice is not a display of power, but a revelation of truth. He lets people feel what they made others suffer. There is a misunderstanding many carry when they think about God's justice. They imagine thunderbolts, immediate wrath, swift vengeance. But divine justice doesn't always come wrapped in fire and fury. It doesn't always appear on the surface of things. It doesn't even need to, because the power of heaven does not need to shout when it knows how to whisper to the soul. God's justice is not theatrical, it's surgical. It does not aim to merely punish, it aims to expose. And those who once walked with pride over the backs of others will not be crushed by a divine hand from above, but by the unbearable weight of their own reflection. That is the nature of justice when it comes from heaven. It allows people to feel what they made others feel. When they hurt you without blinking, they were not just acting out of cruelty, they were walking in blindness. They thought your pain would stay confined to your heart, hidden from sight, easy to dismiss. But nothing is hidden from the eyes of God. And the strange thing about justice is that it doesn't always chase a person down in public. Sometimes it sits quietly in the corners of their private life, in their relationships, in their restlessness, in their regrets, in the silent parts of their soul where their pride can't reach. It waits for the right moment, not for revenge, but for revelation. God does not return your pain to them with the same gestures. He returns it in ways only they can understand, not to humiliate them before others, but to awaken them within themselves. He allows their own actions to come back to them in a language their conscience cannot ignore. If they used silence to destroy your spirit, then silence will return to them in their loneliest nights. If they mocked your tears, then tears will visit them in moments where no one stays long enough to comfort them. If they betrayed your trust, they will encounter betrayal, dressed in a form they never expected. Not because you willed it, but because God's justice moves by a design no human can escape. It is a difficult thing for a person to stand in the very pain they once dismissed. When the tables turn, not by your hands but by God's, it is not a punishment that breaks them. It is the recognition, the awareness, the unavoidable realization that what they are enduring is not random. It is not bad luck. It is not injustice. It is the very emotion they thought they'd never feel. And it is returned not to destroy them, but to speak. And it speaks louder than any argument you could have made. That is the power of truth. It needs no defense when it is finally felt. There is no act more profound than being handed your own choices as a mirror. This is the moment when God's justice reveals not just what someone has done, but who they've become. And the shame that was once foreign to them becomes familiar. They begin to replay moments they never thought mattered. A sentence they said to you in anger, a moment they laughed while you cried, a season where they walked tall while you begged for understanding. Suddenly, those memories don't feel like power anymore. They feel like weight, a weight only truth can carry. And while all of this unfolds, you do not need to involve yourself in the process, because divine justice does not need your help, it only needs your trust. While you were crying out for clarity, God was writing a verdict. While you were healing in silence, God was preparing a lesson. And the lesson was not just for them to suffer, it was for them to see what they've done, see who they hurt, see the heart they overlooked, and perhaps see themselves for the first time in years. That is what makes divine justice sacred. It is not about making them pay, it is about making them aware, because awareness is the only true weight shame can carry. The moment they understand, truly understand, what they made you feel, is the moment God's justice is complete, not in vengeance, but in revelation, not in punishment, but in truth. The shame they never felt is now becoming the voice in their head. They can't escape what they once denied. There is something deeply unsettling about the silence that follows wrongdoing. At first, it feels like victory to the one who caused the harm. They walk away untouched, unfazed, unchanged. There is no punishment, no confrontation, no consequence. To them, the silence feels like freedom. They assume that the absence of immediate backlash is evidence that what they did wasn't that serious, or worse, that they got away with it entirely. But what they don't understand is that God's silence is not permission. It is space. Space for the soul to wander deeper into itself until it reaches the place where truth begins to whisper. And that whisper always comes. In the beginning, it's faint, easy to ignore, a flicker of memory, a name that resurfaces, a dream that disturbs, a song that suddenly feels heavy. They brush it off, distract themselves, drown it with noise or novelty. But the whisper returns, louder this time, and this time it brings feelings they've never entertained, guilt, regret, even fear. The same shame they denied when you were breaking is now showing up in their own internal world. Uninvited, persistent, and growing. You see, the mind is not a vault. It doesn't keep secrets locked away forever. It's a mirror. And eventually, what a person does to others begins to show up in reflections they can't run from, in sleepless nights, in broken connections, in sudden tears they can't explain. the mind starts to call back memories they thought they buried. But now, those memories are not just recollections. The laughter they shared at your expense now sounds hollow. The decisions they justified start to feel repulsive, and what once felt powerful now feels cowardly. That is what shame does when it returns. It doesn't need anyone else to say a word. It becomes the voice in their own head. And the most devastating part of that voice is this: it speaks in the same tone they once dismissed you with. It mimics their own arrogance. It reminds them of their smirks, their eye rolls, their apathy. And now that voice is no longer directed outward. It's turned inward. Where they once ridiculed you, now they ridicule themselves. Where they once showed indifference to your tears, now they question why their own won't stop flowing. The shame they never wanted to feel has found its way home. This voice doesn't shout with violence. It speaks with accuracy. It is specific. It remembers details they hoped were forgotten, the moments they abandoned you emotionally, the cruel things they said and laughed off, the hours you waited for their apology that never came. It brings those moments back, not as memories to cherish, but as ghosts to confront. And confrontation with one's past is not something pride can silence. It sits heavy, it lingers. And while they carry on pretending to the outside world that they're fine, their inner world tells a different story. One of unrest, one of torment, one of realization. The very peace they robbed you of becomes the peace they now crave, but cannot reach. Because shame, once awakened, wraps itself around the soul like a storm cloud that follows them into every bright room. They can smile, but the smile no longer feels real. They can succeed, but the success tastes stale. They can be surrounded by people but feel alone in ways they can't explain. That's not punishment. That's the echo of truth. And perhaps the cruelest irony is that they now begin to understand what you felt. Only there is no one around them patient enough to endure it. No one who cares enough to listen to the full weight of their guilt. And so, the very thing they ignored in you becomes the thing they are now drowning in. Not because you wanted it, but because truth demands balance, the soul demands reckoning, and the shame they once denied has become the most honest part of them. It doesn't need to be told where to go, it knows its way. It travels through the cracks in their ego, finds the parts they locked away, and settles into the center of their conscience. And from there, it begins to speak. Softly, clearly, relentlessly. There is a divine mystery in the way life rearranges itself when God decides that the time for hidden injustice has passed. It rarely happens the way we imagine. It doesn't come with grand announcements or fire falling from the sky. It happens in quiet moments that echo with a weight far greater than noise. When God turns the tables, it is not a spectacle, it is a lesson. Not a lesson for the world to watch, but for the soul that refused to understand. They believed their actions were buried, that your pain was temporary, that their treatment of you would be lost in time and memory. They underestimated the weight of the human spirit and overestimated their control over it. What they didn't see then was that every cruel word, every act of betrayal, every moment they diminished your worth was being collected, not by you in bitterness, but by God in silence. He stores such moments not for revenge, but for correction, for awakening. Because when someone continues in wrongdoing without consequence, it is not grace, it is a delay. And every delay from God has a reason. The reason is always love, but love doesn't always look like comfort. Sometimes love looks like disruption. When someone becomes so blind to the damage they cause that they begin to believe in their own false goodness, The most merciful thing God can do is to remove the illusion. And when He does, it is jarring, because they were not prepared to see themselves. They were only prepared to escape accountability. But God does not seek retribution, He seeks revelation. So the table begins to turn, slowly, subtly. The very things they mocked in you become the things they lack in others. The stability they took for granted in you becomes chaos in new connections. The peace you gave freely becomes tension they cannot soothe. The love you offered without limits becomes scarcity they cannot refill, and it confuses them. At first, they do not understand what is happening, but confusion turns into discomfort, and discomfort into introspection. And it is then, in the silence between the noise, that God begins to speak. He does not shout. He allows their circumstances to mirror the wounds they once ignored, not to crush them, but to show them, to make them feel the weight of what they handed out so carelessly. The tables turn not to destroy, but to deliver understanding. Because there are some lessons that cannot be learned through logic. They must be lived. And what they refused to see in you, they are now forced to face in themselves. And here is the beauty. They may never tell you. They may never come back and confess. But you will know, not because you see them suffer, but because you will feel peace where once there was unrest. You will feel light where there was once confusion. You will feel no need to explain, no urge to seek validation. That is the surest sign the tables have turned, when you no longer carry the weight they gave you, because it has returned to the place it was always meant to be, not in cruelty, but in clarity. For the person who harmed you to truly change, they must feel what they inflicted, not in exact detail, but in spiritual weight. They must carry the echo of what they ignored, and when that echo grows too loud to dismiss, they are no longer who they were when they hurt you. They begin the long, painful process of seeing what they couldn't before, seeing who you were, seeing what you carried, seeing the love they didn't understand. And though it may come too late to repair what was broken, it will not be too late for truth to rise. That is what God does. He does not settle scores. He restores balance. And sometimes that balance looks like shame returning, not to humiliate, but to awaken. Because awakening is the beginning of redemption. And redemption begins the moment someone finally feels the truth they once refused to see. You were hurt without cause, and they felt no shame. They walked away unbothered, leaving you to carry the weight of what they did. But God never turned His eyes. While they dismissed your pain, He preserved it. He stored every tear, every silent cry, every moment you questioned your worth, not to punish them by your hand, but to return what was never yours to carry. And now, the same shame they avoided is returning, not as your justice, but as God's. Not to ruin them, but to awaken them. They will feel what they made you feel. They will face what they refused to see, not because you asked for it, but because divine justice always completes what human hands cannot. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to seek revenge. Your healing is the loudest truth. Let their silence now speak to them the way yours once cried to God. He heard you then, and He is answering now. So walk in peace, not because they apologized, but because God has lifted the shame they placed on you and delivered it where it truly belongs.